Welcome to the Brain and Behavior Research Foundation Meet the Scientist monthly webinar series. I'm Dr. Jeff Borenstein, BBRF's President and CEO. Today, Dr. Autumn Kujawa will present Enhancing Positive Emotions to Prevent Depression in Youth. BBRF is the world's largest private funder of mental health research grants supporting transformative discoveries in order to develop improved treatments, cures, and methods of prevention. The high quality of the research we fund is made possible by the BBRF Scientific Council. This group of over 190 prominent mental health researchers reviews each grant application and selects the most promising ideas with the greatest potential to lead to breakthroughs. The Scientific Council guides the Foundation to fund creative and impactful basic, translational, and clinical research relevant to the whole spectrum of mental health. One reason that the research funded by BBRF has such a great impact is because we do not limit our focus to one illness or condition. Since 1987, the Foundation has awarded over $450 million to fund more than 6,500 research grants around the world and across a broad spectrum of brain illnesses, including addiction, ADHD, anxiety, autism, bipolar disorder, borderline personality disorder, depression, eating disorders, OCD, post-traumatic stress, schizophrenia, as well as suicide prevention. Today, I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Autumn Kujawa. Dr. Kujawa is an associate professor in psychology and human development at Vanderbilt University and director of the Mood, Emotion, and Development Lab. Our webinar will begin with Dr. Kujawa's presentation, and then will be followed by Q&A. To submit your questions, please use the questions tab on the control panel. Feel free to submit the questions at any time. Following the presentation, I'll ask as many questions as possible in the time allotted. And now, I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Kujawa. Autumn, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Jeff, for that introduction, and thank you all for being here today. I am very grateful for the support of the Brain and Behavior Research Foundation over the years, and I appreciate the opportunity to speak with such a large group with interest in this topic. So today I'm going to be talking about work we are doing in my lab focused on trying to increase positive emotions to try to prevent or reduce the risk for depression in adolescents and young adults. For the first part, I will briefly highlight some of our work using affective neuroscience methods to try to better understand emotional processes in the brain that contribute to vulnerability for depression. And then next, I will talk about our efforts to translate these findings to interventions to try to enhance reward responsiveness and positive emotions with the goal of preventing depression. This intervention work is still in relatively early stages, but we think the results are looking promising, and that this way of thinking about prevention in terms of what are the core processes driving depression and developing focused interventions to target those even before symptoms develop is really a potentially transformative approach to prevention. And I'm excited to talk with you all about that today. So first, I want to talk briefly about why depression. So I have a background in applying neuroscience methods to understand a broader range of emotional and behavioral problems across development. I also have a newer line of research supported by BBRF and the National Institute of Mental Health that focuses on neural predictors of suicidal behaviors in adolescents. But much of my research to date has really focused on depression and depression vulnerability. I think about depression broadly. So this includes specific diagnoses like major depressive disorder or persistent depressive disorder, but also more mild presentations and symptoms of feeling sad, down, empty, irritable, or losing interest or pleasure in things people typically enjoy. So rates of clinical depression tend to be relatively low in children, but increase in prevalence in adolescents, with up to 25% of youth experiencing depression broadly defined. There is also evidence that rates are increasing across time. And we know that early emerging depression is associated with impairments in academic and career outcomes, as well as social functioning across the lifespan, and elevated risk of suicidal thoughts and behaviors. Now, we have some really great treatments for depression, including cognitive behavioral therapy and antidepressant medications like SSRIs, but these don't work for all people. And given how prevalent and impairing depression is, we need more options, including more options to intervene earlier in development. And so there are many different ways to approach this problem of how to improve our treatments and outcomes from depression, and many promising advancements happening. In my work, so I'm going to talk about the approach we take in my lab. We take a developmental approach to thinking about depression. So we try to understand how core emotional and social processes that we know can be altered in depression, how these emerge across development, and we use multiple methods, including brain measures, to identify new risk factors. But ultimately, we're interested in the translational aspects in terms of how we can take this knowledge and develop new ways to intervene and to prevent depression. Because the big picture goal of the work in my lab is really to have an impact in reducing the burden of depression and associated symptoms and disorders on youth and families. So one way we do this is using neuroscience methods like EEG, which is shown here. So this is where we measure brain activity with electrodes that are placed on the scalp in a stretchy cap. It's a non-invasive method that's safe and can be used across development, even with new infants. We can use EEG to study emotional processes that we think are relevant to depression, and we find that measuring brain activity in this way gives us unique information about depression vulnerability, beyond what we can get from things like asking people or parents about their own emotional experiences. So in my lab, we focus on processes like responses to reward, and that means what happens in the brain when something good happens. And so in the lab, we use computer tasks to try to elicit these responses. And I'll show you an example of that in a moment. But the idea is that these brain responses may look similar in real world daily experiences. And individual differences in responses to these types of events may contribute to depression risk. So rewards include things like finding out you got a good grade on a test, or you got a pay raise, or you got a compliment from a friend. So these responses to rewards should then be related to experiences of positive emotions. And when I talk about positive emotions, I'm talking about things like happiness, joy, excitement, contentment. We also look at responses to loss. That is what happens in the brain when something bad happens that results in a loss of something important. So this could be money, like unexpectedly having to pay a large bill, could be loss of opportunities, like not getting into the school that you wanted, or a loss of a loved one or a pet. And lastly, in my lab, we're very interested in social relationships and dynamics because of the key role that our social connections play in mental health. And so we use EEG to study how people process social information, like wondering, did that person just give me a disapproving look? Do they like me? We are constantly taking in this kind of social information and trying to make sense of it. So there's a broad range of processes that we can study with EEG to try to understand these early emerging vulnerabilities. Today's talk, I'm going to focus on this idea of reward responsiveness. But I do want to note that low responses to rewards is just one of many factors that contributes to depression, and it may not be a contributing factor for all people. But it is where we're seeing emerging evidence in my lab that we can start to take evidence from neuroscience and translate it to more focused interventions. So we know from a large body of research using a range of methods that depression is often characterized by low responses to rewards. So many people report this subjective experience and that the world feels less rewarding. They're no longer interested in enjoying things like they did before, and they feel less motivated to try to seek out positive things in the world. We also see it with neuroscience methods in terms of reduced brain responses when anticipating possible future rewards and in responses to reward feedback. And behaviorally, we see patterns where some people with depression have more difficulty learning associations between behaviors and reward outcomes. So my research takes a developmental perspective in examining these associations. It's based around the idea that some of these emotional and cognitive styles that we observe in depression may actually emerge earlier in development and be vulnerabilities that shape later risk for depression in combination with other factors. So these might not just be markers of the disorder of depression or symptoms, but instead processes that actually contribute to its development. And if we can understand those, we think that that's useful for a few reasons. So if we know that depression presents in many different ways and has many different causes. So if we can better understand these risk and vulnerability processes, we may be able to get more to the core of what is causing the symptoms. And if we can better measure these risk processes across development, we may be able to identify risk markers before symptoms develop. And then we might be able to develop interventions to specifically target these vulnerability processes and intervene early. In doing so, we might be able to change some of these risk processes and prevent or at least reduce the risk or severity of later depression. So this is really the framework of thinking in terms of understanding these core risk vulnerability processes for depression using a developmental lens. That's really central to the work in my lab. And then thinking about what that means translationally, if we can develop interventions to target these earlier processes and prevent depression. Now, when I talk about lab-based measures of reward responses, this is typically measured using computerized games that allow us to look at behavioral and brain responses to rewards and losses. But the idea is that these computerized tasks that we use in the lab might be getting at responses that are really a proxy for how people process good and bad things that happen out in the real world. And being able to look at individual differences in the magnitude of these responses and think about how those might manifest in people's daily lives and how that might contribute to the development of depression. So this is a very simple task that we and other labs commonly use to elicit responses to rewards across development. So this has been used with young children through adulthood. So the way that this works is first two doors are presented on the screen and participants are asked to guess which one has a prize behind it. They're told that if they guess correctly, they will see a green upward arrow indicating a win of 50 cents. But if they guess incorrectly, they will see a red downward arrow indicating a loss of 25 cents. The values are different because this allows us to account for probability. So win and loss is presented on equal numbers of trials. But people actually accumulate money, they win a small amount of money at the end of this game. For younger kids, this can also be adapted to points or prizes or treats if they have difficulty understanding concepts around money. So while people play this game, we use EEG, those electrodes placed on the scalp, to measure their brain responses to the arrows. So that is to that feedback indicating rewards or losses. So we record the continuous EEG with the electrodes on the scalp, and then we segment the neural responses to specific stimuli, like the green arrows indicating rewards and the red arrows, and we average across each type of trial. So here you can see along the x-axis, time is plotted in milliseconds, and at 0 milliseconds is when feedback is presented, where that arrow with the money is shown. And so that's when they're seeing an upward arrow, like they won money. So that's the green line there. And then along the y-axis is the brain activity in microvolts. So you can see here the green line, which is the response to rewards, and the red line, which is the response to losses, overlap early on, but around 300 milliseconds, they start to differentiate. And this is a component from the EEG that we call the reward positivity component. And it's a really immediate response to rewards and losses. This is happening in just a fraction of a second. And we've shown that this correlates with activation of reward-related circuits in the brain. It also correlates with behavioral and self-reported tendencies to experience positive emotions. So we think this is a really reliable, really valid measure of reward processing in the brain that can be used across development. We can also look at EEG signals presented across the scalp. And so we see that this component is maximal at the top of the head over frontocentral sites. So now I'm going to briefly highlight just a few of my studies using neural measures like this to examine risk for depression, because I really want to make the point about how we're kind of using this neuroscience research to then inform the development of interventions. So first, in an early study that was part of my dissertation many years ago, I looked at neural responses to rewards in 9-year-old children of parents with and without depression and anxiety histories. And so parental depression is a strong risk factor for the development of depression in offspring. So we know that offspring of depressed parents are at much higher risk of developing depression themselves. So by studying children of parents with depression before they develop a depressive episode, we can start to identify vulnerabilities that might contribute to this increased risk. So we're really asking the question here of what makes children of parents with depression more susceptible to developing depression themselves. What are the possible mechanisms of this association, and does reward responses play a role? So in this sample, none of the children had experienced a depressive episode yet themselves, but we found that mothers' histories of depression was associated with child reward responses. And it's important to note that we also looked at depression in biological fathers. We did not see the same pattern of effects. It seems specific to mothers. And there's a number of reasons for that. It could be in part because fewer fathers had depression overall. It's also a little bit more challenging to engage fathers in research, so we didn't directly interview all of the fathers in the study. And there are also likely important factors to consider, like how much time each parent spends with children and the developmental timing of that. But what we found for mothers is that children whose mothers had a history of clinical depression, but not anxiety, showed blunted reward responsiveness compared to other children with other types of histories. So that was both compared to children and mothers with no history of depression or anxiety, and surprisingly, even reduced compared to children of mothers who had both depression and anxiety, and a trend for the same pattern on children of mothers who had only anxiety. And so we also found that this reward responsiveness in children was associated with the severity of mom's depression when we looked at the worst kind of episode that mom had experienced. And so it wasn't always even within the child's life, but mothers who had more severe histories of depression, the children tended to show more blunted reward responsiveness. So this pattern suggests that low reward responsiveness may be observable in children at risk for depression before they develop depression themselves. And even though depression and anxiety commonly co-occur, this seems specific to depression risk. Next, we follow the sample up 3 years later into early adolescence, and they were reassessed around age 12. And I looked at these reward responses at age 9, predicting changes in child symptoms at age 12, and found that relatively blunted reward responsiveness was associated with relatively greater symptoms, even accounting for earlier depression. So low reward responses prospectively predicted increases in depression across time. So you can see this in the scatter plot here. You can see this is also reflected here in the EEG data. So this is looking at the brain responses at age 9, but split by how depression was looking at age 12. So sort of looking back in time. So those who had relatively high depression at age 12, which you can see circled there, when we looked back, we saw relatively blunted reward responses, less difference between brain responses to reward and loss feedback in that guessing reward test. But those who had low depression at age 12 had more robust reward responses when we looked back at age 9. So a few things to note here. So this is really promising, and others have seen similar effects in terms of these reward components predicting later depression. But a few things to note is that we also ask kids at age 12 about how they tend to respond to rewards using a questionnaire. And those who reported that they are less responsive to rewards also showed greater depressive symptoms. So we're seeing this kind of converging evidence across self-report and neural measures. But interestingly, the brain measures and the self-report, when we asked people, were accounting for kind of unique variance in outcomes. They were telling us unique things about later depression, really supporting the utility of integrating neuroscience in this clinical research, that it's telling us something different about child emotionality and development that has relevance for thinking about clinical outcomes and interventions. Also, you can see that the association is relatively modest here. So these are not large effects, and there are a number of possible reasons for that. Reward responses are just one piece of the puzzle of depression, and we need to think about how this interacts with other risk factors. In this study, the association was strongest for kids who also had a maternal history of depression. So it seems like we're seeing evidence of multiple interacting risk factors in shaping these pathways to depression. In other work, we've also seen interactions between low reward responsiveness and stress. in predicting later depression. So it seems like it's not just one factor that matters, but it's thinking about the combinations of multiple interacting factors. Okay, so I talked a little bit about some of my work looking at responses to feedback about winning money, but that's just one way to measure reward responses and positive emotions. In my lab, we've been very interested in trying to get more at positive emotions and rewards in the context of social relationships rather than just these tasks involving money. And so there's a few different ways that we've done this. Today, I just want to highlight one example for time. This is in a study of college students, so it's in an emerging adult age. And so when we get to the intervention section of this talk, I'm going to show you some work we've been doing both with children of mothers with depression and young adult college students who tend to show relatively high rates of depression overall and high risk for depression. And so I'm highlighting here some of the neuroscience research in both of these age groups, so children at risk for depression and then also in college students. So for this study, we developed and validated a set of emotional images designed to get at brain responses to social scenarios that adolescents and young adults commonly experience. So this includes both negative events like fights or arguments with peers or parents, and positive events like happy romantic relationships, fun time with friends, happy, loving photos with family. And we compare brain responses to these images to responses to boring or neutral images, like images of household objects or city streets without much happening there. So the reward positivity component that I mentioned earlier is specific to feedback, but it's not as relevant for these complex emotional images like this. But we can measure a more sustained component to these images called the late positive potential. And so this presents from approximately 400 to 1,000 milliseconds in response to images. So it's a bit later, but still this very immediate response happening in less than a second. And it is increased to both positive and negative emotional images compared to neutral. And you can see it's reflected also in the back. It's reflected over the scalp here. It's maximal over the back of the head. So a little bit of a different distribution than what we see with our reward positivity component. And this is more parietal and occipital sites. And one thing to note, so we can measure it in response to both of these images. Given the focus on reward responses and positive emotions today, I'm going to focus on the results related to the positive images. So in this study, we initially tested these images in a sample of college students, and we examined neural responses. And so we tested these images to validate them and examine neural responses to them. And that happened all before the COVID pandemic. Then when the pandemic started and college campuses closed down, we recognized this as a way to look at individual differences that predict how people were coping with this major stressor. So these widespread stressors are happening. They're affecting everyone to some degree, but what are some of the factors that impact who is struggling more and who is kind of coping and kind of more resilient to the stressor? So we followed the sample up early in the pandemic, and so we assessed them around April 2020 to ask how they were doing. So including asking about both exposures to COVID-related stressors using a measure that we developed and validated early in the pandemic, and asking them about changes in their depressive symptoms. So we had their depressive symptom measures earlier, then reassessing them here. And so what we found is that this neural response to pleasant interpersonal images interacted with interpersonal stressors. So these were things like separation from others, loss of loved ones, conflict, deaths of loved ones related to the pandemic to predict changes in depression. So you can see here along the red line, this is people who had relatively low responses to positive images. They're blunted in that response to positive images. And we see a stronger association between interpersonal stress and depression there. So the combination of that low neural response plus greater COVID-related interpersonal stress was associated with more increases in depression. For those who had average neural responses to positive images, we still see that association, but it's a little bit weaker. And then for those who had a more robust and enhanced response to those positive images, there's not a significant association between stress and depression. So it's almost like that neural response tends to buffer against those effects of stress. We can see this also reflected in the scalp distribution from the EEG. So this is among people who had high stress exposure. Those who developed greater symptoms had less of a response, less red here in terms of their activation to positive images compared to those who experienced stress but showed relatively low depressive symptoms. So this component from the EEG data reflects sustained attention. So this could be interpreted as tendencies to attend less to positive social information increases depression risk in combination with stressful interpersonal contexts. So potentially intervening to increase responses to reward, responses to positive situations, and attending to the positive could have benefits in terms of reducing depression risk and buffering against stress. Okay, so taken together, I've shown a few examples of evidence from affective neuroscience that show low responses to rewards and pleasant images are observable in children at risk for depression and predict increases in depression across time. And we're not the only ones who have seen these patterns. There's similar evidence from behavioral measures and neuroimaging research like fMRI, pretty consistent evidence of these associations between low positive emotions and reward responsiveness and depression. But then that raises the question of what does this mean? So what are the translational implications? How can we use this information to circle back to that original goal of reducing the burden of depression? And so this is where we don't have it all figured out yet, but I'm going to talk a bit about our thinking about this and what we have been doing in this area. So we tend to see this pretty consistent evidence of low reward responsiveness, which we talked about as linked to positive emotions in depression risk. But when we think about our treatments and preventive interventions for depression, most tend to focus more on negative emotions. So for example, cognitive behavioral therapy or CBT has a strong evidence base for the treatment of depression, and there are promising preventive interventions adapted from CBT also. And it's really important to note, CBT is an excellent treatment. Many people really benefit from it. I highly recommend CBT for people in need of depression treatment. And focusing on negative emotions is also important. We want to be sure to validate these experiences because they're really central to the experience of depression. And also there's normative variation in negative emotions as well. And many people also need support in recognizing and coping with emotions like sadness, anger, and fear. But what we think the neuroscience research may be telling us is that in some cases and for some people, traditional CBT may not be focused enough on rewards and building up these positive emotions. So CBT commonly focuses on things like noticing the connections between thoughts and behaviors that contribute to negative mood cycles, recognizing cognitive distortions or thinking traps that cause us to view things in a more negative way, and working to change those negative thoughts. Behaviorally, CBT for depression often relies on behavioral activation, which involves monitoring daily activities and associations with mood, working to reduce avoidance and increase engagement in activities that break these depression cycles. But there's not as much of a focus on really experiencing the positives of those activities. And it may not be that all people need that, but some people could potentially benefit from more of a direct focus on enhancing these positive emotions. And indeed, there is evidence from adult treatment research that working to increase positive emotions has clinical utility. So Michelle Krask, for example, and her colleagues have developed a therapy called positive affect treatment for adult depression and anxiety. And now in multiple clinical trials, they've compared it to a treatment focusing on reducing negative emotions and found that this positive affect treatment is associated with greater increases in positive affect, as well as reductions in depression, anxiety, and stress, and that this seems to be in part due to its effects on reward processing, aspects of reward processing. So with my collaborator, Katie Burkhouse, we have been developing a new preventive intervention for depression, which is informed by what we know about depression from affective neuroscience and this promise of positive affect treatment for adults. So we call this intervention Family Promoting Positive Emotions, or FPPE, and it is an 8-session dyadic intervention delivered by a skills coach with moms and children together that aims to increase positive emotions in the family. And we think it's really important to work with moms and children together in this way so that because positive emotions build off each other and kind of build up these social influences to kind of really strengthen those emotions. So right now we've been delivering FPPE fully through Zoom to reduce burden on families with needing to come into the lab for in-person appointments. And this format seems to be working pretty well, but it could also be delivered in other formats as well, like in person. So we initially conducted a pilot study to test the intervention, which we recruited moms with depressive symptoms and their 8 to 12-year-old children. Children completed baseline measures of positive affect using phone surveys they completed throughout the day called ecological momentary assessment. And moms and children reported on clinical symptoms before the intervention. They were then randomized to this intervention, FPPE, or written information comparison condition. In this comparison, moms received weekly email newsletters with information about mental health, depression in families, and resources for connecting with treatment. After that 8-week intervention, children repeated measures of positive affect, and moms and children reported again on changes in symptoms. Now, one question here is whether this intervention is effective in enhancing neural measures of reward responsiveness or sustained attention to positive images, which I just told you all a lot about. So we were not able to test that in this initial pilot study, but we recently received a larger grant from the National Institute of Mental Health, which is allowing us to conduct another larger trial, including EEG measures in children. So more on that coming soon, hopefully. So let me talk just a little bit about what FPPE covers, and I have a couple of examples to show you as well to get a sense of how this works. So we use the acronym HAPPY skills to try to integrate the ideas we cover in the intervention and make them easier to remember and understand. So the H here stands for have fun. So this is related to planning positive activities and taking time to enjoy them. Both moms and children plan their own positive activities and shared family activities. A is for anticipating future positive events. So thinking about looking forward to a future event and really what you expect to feel. P is paying attention to the positive, looking for the good things that happened and the silver linings, even in the less good things that happen. The other P is praise and appreciate yourself and others. So this is really building up positivity in the family by thinking about what they like about themselves, their mom, what they like about each other and other loved ones, and recognizing more of those positives. And then the Y is you did it. So giving yourself credit for the positive activities, give yourself credit for the work in these sessions and rewarding themselves. So there's this focus on activities, anticipating positives, attending to the positives, love and kindness and gratitude in those family relationships, and taking credit in the rewards. I want to briefly add here, again, this intervention is really structured and it's focused on teaching and practicing these skills in session. So to do that, we really encourage moms and children to focus on the skills we're working on and focus on the positive during our time together. So we don't work on negative emotions, conflicts, problems, other challenges in the session. But of course, we recognize that many families are struggling with those kinds of things as well. And just saying focus on the positive can come across as pretty invalidating. So we do certainly acknowledge and validate what they're experiencing in terms of negative emotions and stressors, while also trying to stick with the goals of the intervention. And we know for many people, this is probably not going to be enough as a standalone intervention. So we also refer, for our clinical trial, we refer people to other forms of therapy when needed as well. But ultimately, we see this as something where this might be one kind of module that's important for some families, but it can be combined with other sorts of focused interventions to meet the needs of individual families. So I had a very talented former honor student and lab manager, Ann Dow, who designed these workbooks for us. And we have a mascot in these, Happy Hedgehog. And so in these fun workbooks, Happy the Hedgehog models some of these skills. So shown here is positive activities. So there's a lot of moms and children thinking about their own and shared positive activities. And here are some examples of Happy's positive activities: basketball, calling your grandma, snacks, dancing, chatting with our friends. There's also a lot of really planning, like, okay, if you want to have more positives, how do you make that happen? Taking initiative, really taking ownership of that and like thinking through the details. And so here, Happy is planning to go to the movies, invites her friend, writes it in her planner, and then is able to go to the movie and enjoys it. So a lot of really fun examples to engage moms and children. Okay, so I have a couple of video examples to show you how these sessions work. So this is a research assistant professor and working with my lab, Dr. Kaylin Hill, and she's leading activities with a mom and her daughter. I want to note that this is a family who kindly volunteered for these demos. This is not actual research participants to respect their privacy and confidentiality. So one of the things we do is we practice these shared positive activities in session to show how simple and short they can be. It doesn't have to be something time consuming or expensive to bring a bit of joy. And you can see here how the sessions are fun. There's really this positive emotion in the session to really practice that and get a sense of what that's like. So here they're playing a game of 20 questions, which is an activity they came up with and thinking about different ideas of something positive they could do in this session.
Do you want to try thinking of something for us to guess?
You can get something in your mind, and then we'll try and guess it. Just think of something. And got it? Yes, I got it. Okay.
Okay, is it a person?
Nope. Is it outside? No. Nope.
Is it living?
Yes. Oh, I don't. A dog. I can think of it. No, it's because you want a dog.
Yes, that's a great one. That's a great one. Okay, well, that's all of the time we have for our game. Let's take a look at your positive emotion ratings, though, while we practice the activity. So what are you feeling now from a scale of 0 to 10? Okay, so we noticed how 5 minutes of a silly game even changed your high positive emotions to even higher. I saw lots of laughing together.
Yeah.
Okay, so lots of short practices like that in the session, really having that shared positive emotion in those activities, and then planning for how to integrate some of those same things throughout the week and setting goals around positive activities. So the second example here is about recognizing positives in ourselves and others. And the idea here is to start to identify more of the positives about what they like about themselves, children like about themselves, parents like about themselves, what they like about each other and their relationships, and then really taking time to reflect on those feelings of love and appreciation. And the skills coach, this also comes in a little bit later in the session so that the skills coach has things to share as well. And it's really a kind of powerful exercise in terms of seeing, sometimes people often don't talk about these kinds of things and really seeing how meaningful it is to hear what people like about them. So we do this, like all of the skills, in a dyadic way so that moms and kids practice and then share with each other. You'll see the example here.
Okay. So right after those circles, you're going to see our positive emotion thermometer. And let's put in a rating once again of how you're feeling right now. Okay. So let's spend a few moments reflecting on these traits and what we love about ourselves and each other. First, I'm going to invite you both to share a few of the characteristics that you wrote for yourself. Callie, what do you like about you?
What do you like about yourself? I'm a good friend. I'm a good friend. I work hard. I listen to my teacher.
Those are really great attributes.
They are.
I can see why you would like that about yourself. What do you have for you, Kara?
Kind, outgoing, funny, loving, not too serious.
Yeah, absolutely. I see that in your personality, definitely. Okay, now how about what you like in each other? Who wants to go first for that one?
Mom. I love that she's a great friend, her smile, her caring personality. She has such a big heart. She works hard, everything she does. Pretty laid back. Your smile, your hair, your curly hair.
That's a great list.
Okay, your turn.
She's nice. I love her. She's my friend. She is nice to me.
That's such a great list. I really enjoy working with both of you because we laugh every time. And I can tell that you have a great time together too. So I love seeing that. Okay.
Okay, so in terms of the results of our initial pilot study, so we had 55 families who completed the FPPE intervention or a written information comparison. And when we look at child-reported positive affect and symptoms, we see an increase in positive emotions that children reported on those phone surveys that I mentioned. So children in the FPPE group, which is presented here in purple, with the solid line is pre-intervention and the striped lines is immediately post this 8-week intervention. So they showed an increase in positive affect reported on those surveys, whereas those in the written information group presented in green did not show any change in positive affect. So this is really exciting and promising and suggests that we are making changes in a process that we think is really core to the intervention. Now, when we looked at child-reported symptoms of anger, anxiety, depression, perceived stress, we did not find significant effects for changes in other child-reported symptoms. So it is important to note, however, that these children were not selected for having elevated symptoms. They were selected based on mom's symptoms of depression. And so sometimes with intervention, or with preventive interventions, it could take more time to see the effects of the preventive intervention. But when we looked at mom's reports of child symptoms, we did, however, see consistent, significant effects for most symptom dimensions. So specifically, we see that moms reported that children in the FPPE group showed reductions in anger, whereas there was no change in the written information. They also reported reductions in anxiety, reductions in depression, and reductions in perceived stress. So we measured perceived stress here because we conducted this study during the COVID pandemic, and there are pretty consistent links between stress and reward responsiveness and positive emotions. So we wanted to see if increasing positive emotions through this intervention might reduce experiences of stress during this time that was so challenging for many families. And also, since the children did not yet have clinically significant symptoms, they weren't selected for that, then looking at perceived stress might be more of kind of an earlier precursor in terms of how they're coping, even if symptoms haven't yet developed. So we see this kind of across the board in terms of moms' reports of child symptoms looking more promising in the intervention group. And I don't have this presented here, but we're also seeing that moms are reporting improvements in their own symptoms as well, particularly in this intervention group, which is really promising, and that it could suggest that this intervention might have benefits for both children and parents. We also collect qualitative feedback from moms and kids, and we find overall that families really seem to like these sessions and to like this intervention, including both a focus on the positive and having that time together, which we think is really critical to the intervention. So these are some example quotes, like, "I liked working on this together with my son and seeing his progress in recognizing positivity. It focused on positive things and always left me feeling more optimistic." And then the last one from a child, "I liked that I got to spend time with mommy." So we're very excited about FPPE, and we have, as I mentioned, a larger grant from NIMH, so we're able to run a new trial with a larger sample and collecting those EEG data to see if we can change reward-related brain function. But we're also thinking quite a bit about different ways that we can adapt some of these ideas and adapt this intervention to meet the needs of people at different life stages and different contexts. So one question is whether there might be benefits to briefer approaches to sharing these skills. And we've been testing a single session version with college students. So for this preliminary study, we tested this in an unselected sample of college students. So that means they vary in their level of depressive symptoms and mental health and treatment histories to begin with. But we wanted to just do an initial test of kind of the feasibility and potential utility of this intervention. So we recruited college students between 18 and 22 years old. They came into our lab for a single session where they completed clinical measures, were then randomized to a 50-minute intervention. That was either the brief version of promoting positive emotions, which we call BPPE, or a study skills comparison. We selected study skills as a comparison because it could also be delivered through an in-person interaction with a peer skills coach, matched for length of time and the amount of that social interaction, and also offered useful information, but not emotional or mental health related content. Following the sessions, participants completed an EEG because we want to look at immediate effects of this intervention on neural responses to rewards. We're still analyzing those data, so I don't have much to share with you about that yet. But then 1 month later, we asked participants to complete a follow-up questionnaire to look at changes in clinical symptoms, and we have been working on those results, which I'll share with you today. So first, I wanted to quickly show a couple of demo videos again to get a sense of how this works. We are doing these in a live in-person assessment session, as I mentioned. And this is a demo video with 2 students in my lab. Yinru is a graduate student who's acting as the skills coach, and Vanessa as a college-age participant. So in this session, we're focusing on skills to savor past experiences. And the idea of savoring is really attending to positive experiences and thinking about them in a way that kind of draws out those positive feelings. And you can see how Yinru coaches Vanessa to savor the experiences of a dinner with friends by recalling the different sensory experiences. And you can see how that elicits some of those positive emotions in this session.
Okay, well, thank you so much for coming in today. As we have already talked about your positive experiences before, today we're going to focusing on attending to those positive experiences, and also be helpful to take time to reflect and savor some of your positive experiences. So in other words, sustaining happiness and continuing to experience positive emotions that come from these events, even after they pass. We're going to practice now by writing about, and you can also talk to me about a recent positive event that you experienced. So what is the most pleasant event that you experienced in the last week or so?
Last night, my friends and I did a Friendsgiving. So we all got together and cooked food and celebrated before they go home for the holidays.
That sounds so fun. So yeah, it could be something that you make you feel happy or excited or just relaxed and peaceful, whatever is positive for you. And those friends give it so much fun. Okay, great. So now let's take a few minutes and you can think about that event in detail as if you are replaying it. So make note of like saw, what you heard, what you smelled, and what you tasted, and be sure to describe those in detail as well. You can try to let go of any tension or nervousness you have right now. And remember like what those feelings were like when you were in that situation. Does that make sense? Okay, so yeah. Do you want to take some time to think about it and tell me about the event?
Yeah. So last night we all got together at my friend's apartment. So I got to see all of my friends, which is nice because I think around the finals time, everyone's very busy and you might see 1 or 2 people, but not a whole group.
Right.
And there were a lot of different smells going on. We had chicken and mashed potatoes, mac and cheese. So the place smelled great.
Yeah.
And I remember talking to my friends and we had Christmas music on in the background, which some people might think it's a little early for, but we all enjoyed it. And I just remember feeling very happy. There wasn't any stress. It was just calming and happy vibes, and everyone was together, which was really nice, and just celebrating and being thankful for friendship.
Yeah. I imagine you also tasted something.
Yes, after we were done, we got to taste everything, and then had apple pie and ice cream at the end, which was a nice aftertaste.
Awesome. And then an event, did you see anything?
So we didn't decorate, but I got to see all my friends. We got the food. It was just out on her patio, which was nice. So we got to see the sunset.
Awesome. Yeah. So nice job in describing that event. Okay. Well, thank you.
Okay, so those are some that's an example around savoring past experiences. And then you can see that we're really prompting people to re-experience those positive emotions in the session and giving them feedback and strategies to do that. And so in addition to thinking about past experiences, we also try to build up positive anticipation of future experiences by thinking about what they might expect and how much they're really looking forward to that. And so the idea being that having more positive expectations may then increase these positive emotions and also increase motivation and the likelihood of engaging in these activities. So this is a quick example around expecting and visualizing future positives.
And so, as we have already talked about savoring and recounting the positive experience in the past, now sometimes it can be difficult to convince ourselves to engage in positive activities, especially when we have a lot of work or stress in our life. We talked about like taking time and visualizing, reflect on past experiences, and it can also be helpful to spend some time visualizing future positive events that are about to happen to increase your positive emotions in anticipation of these events. So last time we talked about the plan to see your sister, right, next week. So let's try to imagine what that experience would be like. Again, it can be helpful to plan this out or write this out, because then you have some details to reread again in the future. But now you can just imagine and can tell me about like what your opinions are and what sort of details that you can have in the next meeting. So imagine that you are in the situation right now. You're seeing your sister in the hockey game or something. Yeah, and then you can tell me in the present tense as if you are in the moment. So tell me about like what do you see, what do you feel, what do you taste, what do you smell, and what do you hear?
Okay, so I definitely see my family around. My mom and my grandma are coming too. And it might be cold in Ohio, so we'd all like be bundled up in blankets together, which is fun. And my sister would be on the field, and she's her senior year, so she's one of the captains. So she'd probably get a lot of playing time. Yeah. And she's very outgoing, so she's probably yelling to all of her friends if they're on the ball, and hear a lot of cheering and her screaming to her teammates. And I feel really happy being next to my family, but also probably a little cold because it's chilly there. And I think I'd just be happy being surrounded by a bunch of families all celebrating the seniors. Yeah.
Okay, so in our preliminary study of 92 college-age students who were randomized to this brief single session promoting positive emotions or study skills, we first looked at immediate effects on positive and negative emotions. And so we found, as expected and as hoped, in that BPPE group, there was an increase in positive affect from before to after that session. Whereas in the study skills group, there was not a significant change in positive affect. Both groups did decrease in negative affect from before to after the session. So that could be getting comfortable with being there in the at the assessment and things like that. So we saw a change in negative affect overall, but positive affect was specific to BPPE. And then we followed them up again 1 month later and looked at changes in symptoms and well-being during that time. And we have a really interesting and promising pattern of results here. So when we look at depression, there's an interaction between group and time, although the effects within each condition do not reach significance here, but there's a pattern where depression decreases in the positive emotion intervention group, but actually increases in the study skills group. And we see that kind of across a number of outcomes, that there seems to be a tendency with these college students, potentially being a high-risk group, as the semester goes on, we're seeing increases in some symptoms and overall, but this intervention seems to be buffering against some of that. In social anxiety, we see a decrease in the positive emotion focus group and no change in the study skills group. Here for perceived stress, we don't see significant change in the positive emotion focus group, but a pattern of a decrease. And the group in the study skills, it shows increases across time. So it seems that the intervention might be buffering against that kind of typical increase as the semester goes on. And similar for well-being, we're seeing a reduction in well-being across time for the comparison group, whereas the positive emotion focused intervention group is buffered against that. So to summarize our findings, I have shown you some evidence that reduced responses to rewards and reduced positive emotion seem to predict later risk for depression. and that enhancing reward responses and positive emotions could reduce depression risk. And so in addition to kind of thinking about how we target these more specific focus processes, there's a need for brief, accessible, and engaging interventions. And as I've talked a lot about, we're seeing a lot of promise in these positive emotion focused interventions, but that's probably not the whole story. There's other needs, and there may be ways that we can personalize interventions to meet the needs of individual children and families by combining different types of modules and kind of understanding what's happening for individuals at this emotion level. And a few things to note, we're still really in the early stages of testing these positive emotion focused interventions, and a lot of questions remain, like, can we move around these neural markers of reward and attention to the positive? There's also still much to learn about for whom these interventions work, who could benefit most, and factors that impact how well they work. I'll just briefly talk about some future directions for this work and then wrap up. So in my lab has been very busy. So we've been starting another number of active studies to examine reward responses across development, starting with pregnant people and examining how reward processing changes across pregnancy and postpartum and may contribute both to new parents' depression and positivity that they exhibit in interactions with their infants. With my collaborator, Katie Burkhouse, we're preparing for a new project examining developmental trajectories of change in reward processes from preschool to early school age in children at high risk for depression based on parental history and exposure to early adversity. I already mentioned in middle to late childhood, we're testing intervention effects on reward responsiveness in children at risk for depression. And so the big picture goal here is to understand how reward and positive emotions change across development, how they correspond with depression symptoms, and use that to create interventions that are tailored to different stages of development. And ultimately also, we want to be able to use tools like EEG to better understand individual differences in emotional processing that might contribute to depression and to develop personalized interventions, kind of combining modules to meet the needs of individual children and families. I want to also briefly note that we think that these reward processes are also relevant to other forms of psychopathology and other behaviors. And we have a line of work funded in part by BBRF looking at reward processing as predictors of suicidal behavior in adolescence. And we think that that might manifest in a different way than what we see in depression, but by better understanding those processes, we might be able to then translate that to effective preventive interventions. And the last thing I'll mention is I want to highlight an approach that some of my students, Yin-Ru Long and Ricky Sun, have been leveraging large language models through ChatGPT to try to deliver some of these interventions. So, and the idea here would be that this could be a coach to kind of help to guide around positive emotion focused skills. So this is called Pause Chat, and that it will prompt people to use some of these skills that we develop for the positive emotion focused intervention. So helping them to think about noticing and appreciating positive events, savoring, engaging in activities, and having kind of a menu of options, and then getting some coaching around steps to take, reflecting on those feelings, giving some feedback. And so when people answer prompts, it asks for more details and to push further in those experiences. And so we're still in the very early stages of developing and testing this. We need to collect more information on what people think, whether this is a tool that might be useful, but we think that there's potential in new technologies to kind of deliver some of this content and coaching and reminders in ways that can reach more people. And so really, that's what this work is all about, asking questions like, what do we do with this knowledge we have from neuroscience? How do we leverage new technologies and innovation in neuroscience and computer science, and then translate these things to be able to give back to people in a way that really moves the needle in understanding, treating, and preventing depression. So I'd like to thank my wonderful lab, especially my graduate students, staff, and postdocs, and my former lab manager, Ann Dow, who I mentioned developed the workbooks for FPPE. And I'd also, of course, like to thank my collaborators and funding sources, including the Brain and Behavior Research Foundation. And thank you all for listening.
Autumn, I want to thank you for an outstanding presentation and for the work that you're doing. I think prevention is so important, and we as a field in psychiatry only recently has started to focus on that, and your work really is extremely important in terms of that. We don't really have time for questions, but you actually answered a lot of the questions during the course of your presentation. So I want to just again say thank you so very, very much. I also want to thank everybody who joined us today, and please ask you to consider making a donation to BBRF. 100% of every dollar donated for research is invested in our research grants. We're able to do this because our operating expenses are covered by separate foundation grants. That means that when you donate $1 for research, that dollar goes directly to the scientist. To make a gift, please visit our website, bbrfoundation.org, or call us at 1-800-829-8289. This webinar has been recorded. If you've missed any portion or would like to share it with family and friends, please visit the events and webinar page on our website. And please join us again on May 14th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time, when Dr. Allison Waters, a clinical neuroscientist at the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai, New York, will present Optimizing Deep Brain Stimulation for Obsessive-Compulsive Disorder. Thank you, and remember, together we can dramatically improve the lives of those living with mental illness and enable more people to live full, happy, and productive lives. Thank you.